The Shawshank Redemption began as a disappointment in 1994 before earning recognition as one of cinema's greatest achievements. This essay explores how Frank Darabont transformed Stephen King's novella into a timeless meditation on hope, patience, and resilience, examining its narrative design, unforgettable characters, visual language, and haunting score to reveal why a story about imprisonment ultimately became the defining celebration of inner freedom and enduring human spirit. Forever ends. Our objective is to uncover the narrative mechanics and cultural forces that transformed The Shawshank Redemption into IMDb's highest-rated film. We examine how Andy Dufresne's quiet resilience, Thomas Newman's haunting score, and Frank Darabont's restrained visual symbolism quietly redefine familiar prison drama conventions. Ultimately, Shawshank becomes far more than an escape story. It offers a psychological blueprint for enduring institutionalization, preserving hope, and inner freedom all. How does a quiet prison drama with no superheroes, no explosive action sequences, and no franchise ambitions become the highest-rated movie in internet history? How does a film that struggled to fill theater seats in 1994 eventually earn reputation as one of the most beloved motion pictures ever made? The answer isn't hidden inside a shocking plot twist or a groundbreaking special effect. It's buried much deeper, inside the psychology of hope itself. When The Shawshank Redemption opened in theaters, almost nobody expected history to remember it. Its initial theatrical performance was painfully underwhelming, earning only around $16 million during its early run. For the studio, it looked like another respectable adaptation that audiences had simply ignored. Critics appreciated it, but appreciation doesn't always translate into ticket sales. At first glance, Shawshank seemed destined to disappear beneath the weight of a crowded cinematic year. And what a year 1994 was. Audiences were rushing toward Forrest Gump, captivated by its emotional journey through American history. Pulp Fiction was rewriting the language of modern filmmaking with its nonlinear storytelling and unforgettable dialogue. Disney's The Lion King dominated families worldwide, while action films and thrillers continued to command massive attention. Every major conversation surrounding cinema revolved around louder, faster, or more revolutionary experiences. Then there was Shawshank, a slow, reflective story set almost entirely inside prison walls. No elaborate action set pieces, no glamorous locations, no flashy marketing campaign promising spectacle. Just two men, decades of imprisonment, and conversations about hope, friendship, dignity, and survival. On paper, it shouldn't have stood a chance. Yet decades later, millions of viewers across every generation continue placing it above every other film ever made. It consistently occupies the #1 position on IMDb, surviving changing trends, technological revolutions, streaming platforms, and the rise of countless modern classics. New audiences discover it every year, while longtime fans return to it repeatedly, often finding something different each time they watch. That kind of endurance cannot be explained by nostalgia alone. Something inside this film reaches people in a way very few stories ever manage. Whether someone watches it at 18, 35, or 70, its emotional impact somehow evolves alongside them. The older the audience becomes, the richer the experience often feels. Very few films possess that remarkable ability. So what exactly happened? How did a commercial disappointment transform into one of the greatest success stories in cinematic history? Was it simply fortunate timing on television and home video? Was it word of mouth? Did audiences gradually recognize a masterpiece that marketing failed to communicate? Or does the answer lie inside the film's extraordinary understanding of human nature? Because beneath the prison uniforms, concrete walls, and steel bars exists something universal. Shawshank isn't really about prison. It's about every invisible prison people build around themselves. Fear, routine, regret, trauma, hopelessness. Institutionalization becomes more than a physical condition. It becomes a metaphor for the quiet ways people surrender their freedom, long before any walls surround them. Andy Dufresne enters Shawshank, carrying little more than silence, patience, and an impossible belief that life can still hold meaning beyond suffering. That belief seems almost irrational, even dangerous. Inside prison, hope is mocked because hope invites disappointment. It encourages people to imagine a future that may never arrive, and yet that very idea becomes the foundation of everything this story wants to say. Perhaps hope really is a dangerous thing, but perhaps it is also the only thing powerful enough to keep a person alive when every reason to give up feels completely justified. Over the next journey, we'll uncover how Frank Darabont transformed Stephen King's novella into a cinematic meditation on resilience, why every creative decision quietly reinforces its emotional power, and how a forgotten box office disappointment ultimately escaped its own fate to become the film that millions believe defines the very best of cinema. To understand why The Shawshank Redemption continues to resonate decades after its release, we have to look far beyond its famous ending. This isn't simply a retrospective celebrating a beloved classic. It's an exploration of the hidden design choices that transformed an overlooked prison drama into a film that millions consider the greatest ever made. Every scene, every line of dialogue, every quiet pause serves a larger purpose, and by the end of this breakdown, those seemingly ordinary moments will reveal an entirely different level of meaning. We'll begin by tracing the film's unlikely origins, examining how Frank Darabont adapted Stephen King's relatively short novella into a richly layered screenplay without sacrificing its emotional core. We'll explore the creative decisions behind the production, the performances that gave the characters remarkable authenticity, and the visual language that quietly reinforces the story's central ideas. From cinematography to editing, from pacing to symbolism, we'll uncover how technical craftsmanship supports emotional storytelling rather than distracting from it. From there, we'll dive into the architecture of the screenplay itself. Why does the narrative unfold through Red's perspective instead of Andy's? How does the film carefully balance mystery with emotional intimacy? Why do seemingly minor conversations become unforgettable years later? By breaking apart the structure, we'll see how patience becomes one of the screenplay's greatest storytelling weapons. Next comes the psychological heart of the film. We'll examine Andy Dufresne beyond the common image of him as an almost flawless hero. Rather than treating him as a saint, we'll explore him as a carefully constructed archetype of endurance. His silence is rarely passive. his restraint is rarely accidental. Every calculated decision reflects a mindset built around long-term survival instead of short-term victory. In contrast, Red's gradual transformation reveals what hope actually costs when someone has spent decades believing freedom belongs only to memory. We'll also approach Shawshank prison itself from an unusual perspective. Instead of viewing it merely as a setting, we'll treat it as one of the film's most important characters. Its walls don't simply confine bodies. They slowly consume identity, ambition, and imagination. The prison feeds on routine, convincing people that safety is more believable than freedom. Once we recognize Shawshank as a living force within the narrative, every interaction inside those walls gains new psychological weight. No discussion would be complete without exploring Thomas Newman's extraordinary score, whose restrained melodies communicate emotions words deliberately leave unspoken. We'll analyze how music, silence, and atmosphere work together to create one of cinema's most emotionally immersive experiences.
Finally, we'll ask why this story feels even more relevant today than it did in 1994. In an age defined by constant notifications, relentless productivity, digital comparison, and rising anxiety, Shawshank offers a radically different philosophy. It reminds us that resilience isn't loud, progress isn't always visible, and genuine freedom often begins long before circumstances change. That's why revisiting this film isn't simply an exercise in nostalgia. It's an opportunity to understand why its message continues to speak so powerfully to every new generation that discovers it. Chances are, you didn't discover The Shawshank Redemption the way audiences were expected to in 1994. You probably didn't stand in line outside a theater after seeing an exciting trailer or hearing months of marketing hype. Instead, your first encounter was far more personal. Maybe it appeared during a late-night television marathon when you intended to watch only a few minutes before going to bed. Maybe it was sitting on a worn VHS tape borrowed from a local rental store, recommended by someone who simply said, "Trust me." Maybe it became one of those unforgettable father and son movie nights where conversation slowly disappeared because everyone in the room became completely absorbed. For many people, Shawshank wasn't discovered. It quietly found them. Its constant television reruns, especially on networks that seemed to play it every few months, transformed the film into something unusual. Instead of being remembered as a theatrical event, it became a shared cultural experience. Entire generations stumbled across it by accident, only to stay until the credits rolled. Even viewers joining halfway through often found themselves unable to change the channel. There was something magnetic about its quiet confidence. It never demanded attention, simply earned it. And almost everyone remembers certain moments with astonishing clarity. Red's reflective narration, delivered with warmth, wisdom, and quiet sadness, feels less like exposition and more like someone sharing life's hardest-earned lessons. Then there's that unforgettable image of Andy standing beneath the pouring rain, arms stretched toward the sky after years of unimaginable confinement. Even people who haven't revisited the film in years can picture that moment instantly. It has become one of cinema's defining symbols of liberation, not because it's visually extravagant, but because it represents an emotion nearly everyone has longed to feel. That's the hidden reason this story continues to resonate. Most people have never stepped inside a prison, but almost everyone understands what it feels like to become trapped. Sometimes the walls are made of exhausting jobs, financial pressure, broken relationships, fear of failure, grief, anxiety, or routines repeated so often that life begins to feel mechanical. Days blur together. Dreams shrink. Hope becomes something postponed until tomorrow. Andy Dufresne speaks directly to that experience. His journey reminds us that freedom doesn't begin the moment circumstances change. It begins the moment a person refuses to let circumstances define who they are. That idea reaches far beyond prison walls because it reflects struggles nearly everyone carries in some form. But here's the remarkable part. Even if you've watched The Shawshank Redemption 10 or 20 times, there's a good chance you've only experienced the surface of what it's actually doing. Hidden beneath its simple storytelling are layers of visual symbolism, psychological detail, carefully constructed narrative patterns, and subtle filmmaking decisions that quietly reshape how every major scene should be interpreted. Once you notice them, it's almost impossible to watch the film the same way again. And that's exactly why this journey matters. Whether you're revisiting an old favorite or finally looking beneath its familiar moments, you're about to discover why Shawshank continues rewarding audiences long after the first viewing ends. Every legendary film begins long before the cameras start rolling, and The Shawshank Redemption is no exception. Its journey didn't begin inside the towering walls of Shawshank Prison, but with a struggling filmmaker, a generous author, and a decision that could have changed cinematic history forever. Looking back now, it's difficult to imagine anyone other than Frank Darabont directing this story. Yet, for a brief moment that almost became reality. The foundation was laid years earlier through Stephen King's remarkable support for emerging filmmakers. During the late 1970s and 1980s, King introduced what became known as the Dollar Baby program, allowing aspiring directors to purchase the adaptation rights to selected short stories for just $1. It wasn't designed to make money. Instead, it was King's way of encouraging new creative voices and giving unknown filmmakers a genuine opportunity to prove themselves. Frank Darabont became one of those filmmakers. In the early stages of his career, he adapted King's short story The Woman in the Room through the Dollar Baby program. Although it wasn't a commercial production, the project established a relationship built on mutual respect. King recognized Darabont's understanding of his characters, while Darabont demonstrated something far more valuable than technical skill. He understood that King's stories were rarely about monsters or supernatural events. At their heart, they were stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary emotional circumstances. That connection stayed alive. When Darabont later read King's 1982 novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, he immediately saw something many others overlooked. The novella wasn't simply about an innocent man escaping prison. It was a meditation on time, friendship, institutionalization, dignity, and the quiet persistence of hope. Instead of treating the material as another prison thriller, Darabont recognized its profound emotional potential. He knew the story demanded patience rather than spectacle. After securing the adaptation rights, Darabont spent years carefully shaping the screenplay, expanding the novella while remaining faithful to its emotional core. His script impressed Hollywood almost immediately. Industry executives recognized that this wasn't an ordinary adaptation. The dialogue felt authentic, the characters possessed unusual emotional depth, and the narrative unfolded with remarkable confidence. That attention eventually reached Castle Rock Entertainment. The studio loved the screenplay so much that a fascinating opportunity emerged. Rob Reiner, whose acclaimed adaptations of Stephen King's work included Stand By Me and Misery, reportedly became interested in directing the project himself. Castle Rock even offered Darabont approximately $3 million for the screenplay, allowing Reiner to take over the director's chair. At the time, Tom Cruise was discussed as a potential choice for Andy Dufresne. For a first-time feature director, the offer was almost impossible to refuse. $3 million represented financial security, industry recognition, and an extraordinary career opportunity. Many aspiring filmmakers would have accepted immediately, reasoning that watching an established director bring their script to life was better than risking everything on a debut. Darabont saw it differently. He believed Shawshank wasn't simply a screenplay he had written. It was a story he deeply understood. Every emotional rhythm, every quiet pause, every conversation about hope had been imagined through his own directorial vision. Selling the script would have meant surrendering the film he already saw in his mind. Instead of choosing certainty, he chose creative ownership, even though failure could have ended his directing career before it truly began. That decision shaped everything audiences know today. Casting reflected the same willingness to prioritize emotional truth over literal accuracy. In Stephen King's novella, Ellis Boyd Red Redding is described as an older Irishman, earning his nickname from his red hair. Darabont broke completely from that description by casting Morgan Freeman. Rather than viewing the source material as a rigid blueprint, he focused on who could best embody the character's wisdom, quiet humor, and emotional honesty. Freeman delivered exactly that. His calm voice became the soul of the film, transforming Red's narration into one of the most memorable storytelling devices in cinema. His friendship with Tim Robbins' reserved Andy Dufresne created a relationship built not on dramatic speeches, but on subtle trust developed over decades. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine the film with anyone else in either role. The production's search for authenticity extended beyond casting. Rather than relying entirely on studio sets, the filmmakers searched extensively for a prison capable of conveying both physical grandeur and emotional decay. They eventually discovered the abandoned Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, whose towering Gothic architecture possessed exactly the atmosphere Darabont envisioned. The location became far more than a backdrop. Its endless corridors, weathered stone walls, rusting cell blocks, and overwhelming scale reinforced the psychological weight pressing down on every character. The prison itself seemed alive, silently watching generations of inmates surrender to routine. Even before audiences consciously recognized it, the building communicated confinement through architecture alone. Ironically, the film that almost lost its director, altered its cast, and risked being reshaped into a very different Hollywood production became unforgettable precisely because Frank Darabont trusted his instincts. He rejected the safer path, embraced unconventional choices, and pursued emotional authenticity over commercial formulas. That unwavering conviction became the first act of hope in a story ultimately dedicated to proving that hope, no matter how fragile it appears, can change everything. To understand why the Shawshank Redemption initially failed, we have to travel back to one of the most extraordinary years Hollywood has ever experienced. In hindsight, 1994 feels almost mythical, a single calendar year that produced an astonishing collection of films still celebrated decades later. It wasn't simply a competitive marketplace. It was a cultural explosion where groundbreaking stories competed for the same audience at exactly the same moment. Moviegoers were spoiled with choice. Forrest Gump became an emotional phenomenon, blending romance, comedy, history, and drama into an irresistible crowd pleaser. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction completely reinvented modern independent filmmaking with its nonlinear storytelling, unforgettable dialogue, and magnetic performances. Disney dominated family entertainment with The Lion King, a global event that transcended animation itself. Meanwhile, action fans rushed to speed, Jim Carrey exploded into superstardom with The Mask, and audiences embraced hits across nearly every genre imaginable. Every weekend offered another cinematic event. Against that backdrop arrived The Shawshank Redemption, a quiet prison drama with no obvious commercial hook. It wasn't based on a best-selling novel that audiences widely recognized. It wasn't packed with action. It didn't feature an epic romance. It offered no spectacular visual effects and no franchise potential. Instead, it asked viewers to spend more than 2 hours inside prison walls, watching conversations unfold slowly between characters whose greatest battles were internal rather than physical. From a marketing perspective, it was an incredibly difficult film to sell. Even the title became an obstacle. The Shawshank Redemption sounded mysterious, but it also confused potential audiences. Many people couldn't remember it after hearing it once. Others struggled to pronounce Shawshank, while some mistakenly assumed it was a historical drama, a religious film, or even a documentary. Unlike titles such as Speed or The Mask, which instantly communicated tone and genre, The Shawshank Redemption required explanation before audiences even understood what kind of experience they were being offered. That confusion extended into advertising. How do you create a trailer for a film whose greatest strength is emotional payoff? Revealing too much would undermine the carefully constructed narrative. Revealing too little made the story appear slow and uneventful. Marketing teams found themselves promoting a prison movie that wasn't primarily about prison, a drama that wasn't driven by romance, and an inspirational story that deliberately avoided sentimental shortcuts. The absence of a traditional female lead also made promotion more challenging by Hollywood standards of the time. While many successful dramas balanced their narratives with romantic relationships, Shawshank focused almost entirely on male friendships formed inside an isolated institution. Its emotional core depended on patience, trust, and quiet transformation, rather than conventional dramatic formulas. Everything about the film resisted easy categorization. Ironically, the people who actually watched it reacted very differently. During test screenings, audiences responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. Viewers consistently gave the film exceptionally high scores, praising its emotional impact, memorable characters, and deeply satisfying conclusion. Executives recognized they had something genuinely special on their hands. The problem wasn't whether people liked the movie after seeing it. The challenge was convincing enough people to buy a ticket in the first place. This created one of the strangest contradictions in modern film history. Audience satisfaction remained remarkably high, yet theatrical attendance stayed frustratingly modest. Positive reactions echoed from one screening to the next, but the crowded marketplace drowned out those voices before they could build significant momentum. Bigger films dominated newspaper headlines, television coverage, and public conversation, leaving Shawshank fighting for attention despite earning extraordinary praise from those fortunate enough to experience it. Word of mouth slowly began working its quiet magic. Friends recommended it to friends. Families suggested it during weekend movie nights. Critics continued championing its craftsmanship. Unlike many films that explode immediately before fading from memory, The Shawshank Redemption grew gradually, almost organically. Every viewer who connected with its message became another advocate, encouraging someone else to discover what they believed had been unfairly overlooked. Still, that process takes time. The theatrical box office rarely rewards patience, and Hollywood often measures success within opening weekends rather than years. By those standards, Shawshank appeared to be a disappointment. Few could have imagined that its true audience had not yet arrived. Home video, VHS rentals, and constant cable television broadcasts would eventually give the film something theaters never could: repeated opportunities to find viewers without the pressure of opening weekend expectations. People encountered it unexpectedly, recommended it passionately, and revisited it repeatedly. Slowly but unmistakably, the film escaped the limitations of its original release. In a remarkable twist worthy of its own story, The Shawshank Redemption experienced the very transformation it celebrates. It began overlooked, underestimated, and confined by circumstances beyond its control. But through patience, persistence, and the unwavering belief of those who recognized its value, it ultimately earned the freedom to become one of the most cherished films ever created. Every unforgettable story depends on a powerful beginning, and The Shawshank Redemption opens by placing uncertainty at the center of its narrative. Rather than immediately telling us whether Andy Dufresne is innocent or guilty, Frank Darabont carefully constructs an atmosphere where doubt becomes just as important as truth. The audience isn't invited to solve a mystery through obvious clues. Instead, we're encouraged to experience the crushing weight of judgment before certainty ever arrives. The opening sequence crosscuts between two timelines with remarkable restraint. We see Andy sitting alone in his car outside his wife's house, intoxicated, emotionally devastated, and holding a loaded revolver. Rain falls heavily as anger and betrayal consume him. Inside the house are his wife and her lover, unaware that Andy is watching from the darkness. Every visual element appears to point toward violence: the gun, the alcohol, the motive, the emotional collapse. Without showing the actual murders, the film quietly allows viewers to construct the same assumptions that eventually shape the courtroom's verdict. Then the story shifts into the trial. The prosecutor presents a seemingly airtight case, carefully arranging each piece of circumstantial evidence into a narrative that feels impossible to escape. Andy admits he considered revenge. He admits he drove to the house carrying a gun. He admits he was overwhelmed with rage. Each truthful statement becomes another brick in the prison being built around him. Yet Tim Robbins delivers every answer with extraordinary emotional restraint. Andy doesn't beg for sympathy or attempt theatrical displays of innocence. His calmness almost works against him, making him appear emotionally detached at the exact moment the court expects desperation. That emotional ambiguity becomes one of the screenplay's smartest decisions. Instead of announcing Andy's innocence from the beginning, Darabont allows uncertainty to linger. The audience experiences something remarkably similar to Red's eventual relationship with Andy. Trust isn't given immediately. It's earned over time. As viewers, we enter Shawshank carrying questions rather than certainty, making Andy's gradual revelation feel organic instead of forced. When the guilty verdict is delivered, the film offers no triumphant speeches or dramatic outbursts. Life simply changes forever in a matter of seconds. The sentence isn't merely imprisonment. It's the complete destruction of an identity built over decades. Banker becomes inmate. Citizen becomes convict. Individual becomes number. That transformation truly begins when Andy arrives at Shawshank State Penitentiary in 1947. The prison introduction remains one of cinema's most effective portrayals of institutional dehumanization because of what it refuses to exaggerate. There are no elaborate action scenes or sensationalized violence. Terror emerges from routine. New prisoners are stripped, examined, processed, shouted at, and marched through enormous stone corridors that feel less like architecture and more like the digestive system of some ancient creature preparing to consume them. The towering walls dominate every frame. Cinematographer Roger Deakins repeatedly positions the camera to emphasize scale. The prisoners appear tiny beneath massive Gothic buildings whose cold stone surfaces communicate permanence. These walls existed long before Andy arrived, and they seem destined to remain long after everyone inside is forgotten. Before anyone speaks, the environment itself tells us the true power belongs to the institution. The intake process reinforces that message with ruthless efficiency. Haircuts, uniforms, regulations, inspections, and shouted commands systematically erase individuality. Names become secondary. Personal history becomes irrelevant. The prison doesn't care who these men once were. It only recognizes who they are expected to become. This is where Shawshank begins revealing its deeper purpose. The prison isn't simply designed to prevent escape. It's designed to convince inmates that escape no longer matters. The physical walls are only the beginning. The greater objective is psychological surrender. Almost immediately, that philosophy is embodied through two authority figures whose methods differ but whose control serves the same system. Captain Byron Hadley represents raw physical intimidation. Clancy Brown's performance radiates unpredictable violence, even before his first brutal act. His booming voice, rigid posture, and explosive temper establish him as someone whose authority depends entirely upon fear. When one terrified new inmate breaks down during the first night, unable to stop crying, Hadley's response isn't discipline. It's overwhelming brutality. His savage beating demonstrates that compassion has no place within Shawshank's hierarchy. The lesson reaches every prisoner simultaneously. Fear isn't an unfortunate byproduct of the institution. It's one of its primary management tools. If Hadley governs through violence, Warden Samuel Norton exercises control through moral contradiction. Bob Gunton introduces Norton as calm, disciplined, and deeply religious. Bible verses accompany his speeches. Scripture fills his office. He presents himself as a man devoted to justice, order, and Christian values. Yet almost immediately, the audience notices a profound hypocrisy beneath that respectable appearance. In one hand rests the Bible. In the other waits the baton. Darabont never portrays Norton as a simple villain. His hypocrisy is far more unsettling because he genuinely believes his own righteousness. Religion becomes another instrument of authority rather than a source of compassion. By wrapping cruelty inside moral language, Norton transforms oppression into something that appears virtuous. That contradiction will eventually become one of the film's central themes, exposing the danger of institutions that preach redemption while practicing exploitation. Then comes Red. Morgan Freeman's narration enters almost effortlessly, immediately altering the emotional texture of the story. Instead of experiencing Shawshank solely through Andy's perspective, we're guided by someone who has survived its rhythms for decades. Red understands the prison's unwritten rules because he has accepted them. He knows who to trust, what to avoid, and perhaps most importantly, how to obtain almost anything a prisoner desires. His reputation is simple. I'm the guy who can get it. That understated confidence instantly establishes Red as someone respected not because of physical dominance, but because of experience. He has adapted to the institution so completely that he functions almost like part of its internal ecosystem. When the new prisoners arrive, Red and his friends observe them from a distance, placing informal bets on who will break first during that terrifying initial night. It's a tradition born from years of watching hope collapse. Then Red notices Andy. His first impression becomes one of the film's most memorable observations. He looked like a stiff breeze would blow him over. It's a deceptively simple line. Andy appears physically fragile, emotionally reserved, and entirely unsuited for prison life. Nothing about him suggests survival, let alone transformation. Yet the audience already senses an irony quietly taking shape. Sometimes the strongest people are not those who appear unbreakable. Sometimes true resilience belongs to those who refuse to let the world determine who they become. With its opening act complete, The Shawshank Redemption has accomplished something extraordinary. Without relying on spectacle, it has introduced a prison that consumes identity, authority figures who embody different forms of oppression, a narrator who has accepted captivity, and a protagonist who appears incapable of surviving any of it. The pieces are now in place, but the real story has only just begun. Once the shock of imprisonment begins to settle, The Shawshank Redemption reveals a far more frightening reality. The greatest threat to Andy Dufresne is no longer the sentence handed down by the court. It is the slow, relentless process of surviving each ordinary day inside Shawshank. Frank Darabont deliberately shifts the focus away from dramatic courtroom revelations and toward the exhausting rhythm of institutional life, where suffering is measured not in spectacular moments, but in years. Andy enters a world governed by repetition. Every morning follows the same schedule. Every hallway echoes with the same commands. Every cell reminds its occupants that time has become both their greatest enemy and their only companion. The film refuses to romanticize prison life. Hope is not waiting around the corner. Instead, survival itself becomes an achievement. Loneliness arrives first. Andy keeps almost entirely to himself during his early months. He speaks little, avoids unnecessary attention, and quietly observes the people around him. His silence is often mistaken for weakness, but it actually reflects something much more complicated. Unlike many prisoners who immediately adapt to Shawshank's unwritten social rules, Andy refuses to let prison define his personality. He doesn't try to become tougher than everyone else. He doesn't seek power or status. He simply protects the last pieces of himself that the institution has not yet claimed. Unfortunately, that restraint attracts exactly the kind of attention he wishes to avoid. Among the prison's most feared inmates is a predatory gang known as the Sisters, led by Boggs Diamond. Unlike Captain Hadley or Warden Norton, whose authority comes from official positions, Boggs represents the violence that flourishes when an institution loses its humanity. His attacks are not motivated by revenge or personal conflict. They are about domination, humiliation, and reminding vulnerable prisoners that safety does not exist inside Shawshank. Darabont handles these assaults with remarkable restraint. Rather than exploiting the violence for shock value, the film emphasizes Andy's emotional endurance. The audience understands the horror without lingering on graphic imagery. We witness enough to grasp the brutality while remaining focused on what matters most. Andy's refusal to surrender psychologically. Every attack attempts to strip away his dignity, yet somehow that dignity survives. Red later reflects that Andy fought whenever he could. He rarely won, but he never stopped resisting. That distinction becomes incredibly important. Shawshank teaches prisoners that resistance is pointless because the system always appears stronger. Andy quietly rejects that philosophy. Even when physically overpowered, he refuses to accept complete defeat. His resilience isn't expressed through dramatic victories, but through an unwavering commitment to remain himself despite relentless suffering. This is where the story begins shifting from simple survival toward something more meaningful. One afternoon in the prison yard, Andy approaches Red with an unusual request. By this point, Red has spent years supplying fellow inmates with cigarettes, posters, playing cards, liquor, and countless other items prohibited by prison regulations. If something can be obtained inside Shawshank, Red is the man who knows how to find it. Andy doesn't ask for contraband that offers escape from reality. Instead, he requests a small rock hammer. The request immediately catches Red off guard. A rock hammer is hardly an obvious prison necessity. It's a tiny geological tool designed for shaping and examining rocks, not something associated with violence or rebellion. Red initially assumes Andy has developed an interest in carving his own name into prison walls, or perhaps intends to use it as a weapon. Andy calmly explains otherwise. Before prison, he enjoyed collecting and studying rocks. Geology fascinated him because every stone possessed its own history, formed slowly over unimaginable stretches of time. The hobby may sound insignificant, yet it quietly reveals the way Andy views the world. While prison encourages people to think only about immediate survival, Andy remains interested in things requiring patience, curiosity, and careful observation. Red cannot quite understand it. To him, rocks are simply rocks. But Andy sees beauty where others see ordinary objects. That difference separates him from nearly everyone around him. Even within confinement, his imagination continues searching for meaning beyond concrete walls. Red eventually agrees to obtain the rock hammer, though not without some skepticism. He jokes that the tiny tool couldn't tunnel through prison walls in several hundred years, dismissing any possibility that it could be useful for escape. The audience smiles at the remark because it appears perfectly reasonable. Darabont plants one of cinema's most famous pieces of foreshadowing in plain sight, disguising it as casual conversation. Andy also begins collecting small stones from the prison yard. Using the rock hammer, he patiently shapes them into delicate chess pieces. Once again, the activity seems almost trivial, but symbolically it speaks volumes. Chess is a game built on patience, long-term strategy, and carefully calculated moves rather than impulsive action. Every piece Andy carves represents a mindset fundamentally opposed to the impulsiveness surrounding him. While others focus on surviving today, Andy quietly prepares for a future nobody else can imagine. Notice how the camera lingers on his hands. The carving itself matters less than the act of creation. Prison exists to reduce men to routine, yet Andy continues making something uniquely his own. Every finished chess piece becomes a small act of resistance against institutionalization. Creativity survives where the prison expects only obedience. Red watches these habits with growing curiosity. Initially, Andy appears almost absurdly fragile. He speaks softly, carries himself like a man who belongs in a bank rather than behind bars, and spends his free time studying rocks instead of asserting dominance. Everything about him seems incompatible with Shawshank's harsh reality, yet something refuses to break. Red begins noticing that Andy possesses an unusual kind of strength. It isn't physical intimidation or fearless aggression. It's composure. While many prisoners allow anger or despair to dictate their choices, Andy consistently responds with thoughtful restraint. Even after enduring unimaginable abuse, he refuses to become consumed by bitterness. That quiet dignity gradually reshapes Red's opinion. Respect replaces skepticism. Without realizing it, Red has begun witnessing the first stages of a transformation that will ultimately change not only Andy's life, but his own. Their friendship doesn't emerge through grand declarations or dramatic moments of loyalty. It begins with simple conversations, shared curiosity, and the recognition that some people carry an inner freedom no prison can fully imprison. What initially looked like an insignificant request for a small rock hammer quietly becomes the first move in a much larger game. Neither Red nor the audience fully understands its importance yet. But from this point forward, Andy is no longer merely surviving Shawshank. He has begun building a purpose within it, and that subtle shift marks the true beginning of his extraordinary journey. Every great character arc contains a moment when survival quietly transforms into purpose. For Andy Dufresne, that moment doesn't arrive through violence, revenge, or dramatic rebellion. Instead, it begins with something almost absurdly ordinary. A conversation about taxes on the roof of a prison license plate factory. In almost any other film, this scene would feel insignificant. In The Shawshank Redemption, it becomes the first unmistakable sign that Andy has discovered a way to reclaim power without abandoning the quiet dignity that defines him. The prisoners spend the day repairing the rooftop under the watchful eyes of Captain Hadley and armed guards. The work is exhausting, the sun unforgiving, and one careless mistake could result in severe punishment. Then Andy overhears Hadley angrily discussing an inheritance he is about to receive. Instead of celebrating, the captain is furious about how much of it will disappear in taxes. Most inmates would never dream of interrupting a man as volatile as Hadley. Andy does. Walking toward one of the prison's most feared authority figures looks almost like an act of suicide. Even Red later admits he believed Andy had completely lost his mind. Hadley responds exactly as expected, grabbing Andy and threatening to throw him off the roof. The danger feels immediate because the audience already understands Hadley's capacity for violence. One wrong word could end everything. Yet Andy remains remarkably calm. He explains that, as a former banker, he knows a legal method for protecting the inheritance through a tax-free gift to Hadley's wife. He asks for nothing in return for himself. Instead, He requests 3 bottles of beer for each man working on the roof. The request surprises everyone. Why risk your life only to give away the reward? That's precisely why the scene carries such emotional power. Andy isn't interested in alcohol. He's interested in restoring something prison systematically destroys: a sense of humanity. Later, as the prisoners sit together drinking cold beer beneath the warm spring sun, they experience a feeling almost forgotten inside Shawshank. For a brief moment there are no walls, no uniforms, no shouted commands. They aren't inmates being controlled by an institution. They're simply men sharing a drink after honest work. Red describes the moment perfectly. They felt like free men. Not because the prison disappeared, but because Andy created a small space where dignity briefly overcame confinement. Freedom, the film suggests, is sometimes measured in moments rather than locations. That rooftop conversation also changes Andy's position within Shawshank forever. Word spreads quickly that the quiet banker possesses financial expertise valuable even to the prison's most intimidating officers. Soon guards begin approaching him for advice about taxes, investments, insurance policies, mortgages, and savings accounts. The same intelligence that failed to save him in court suddenly becomes one of the institution's most valuable resources. Eventually, Warden Samuel Norton notices. At first, Norton appears interested only in making use of Andy's legitimate financial skills. Before long, however, that professional relationship evolves into something much darker. The warden oversees prison labor programs generating substantial profits, and Andy becomes the perfect person to organize complicated financial records while disguising illegal transactions beneath layers of seemingly respectable bookkeeping. Without fully realizing it yet, Andy is becoming indispensable. His value no longer lies in physical labor but in knowledge. Norton cannot easily replace someone capable of protecting both his finances and his public image. Ironically, the abilities that once represented Andy's ordinary civilian life now become tools for navigating prison itself. Yet perhaps Andy's greatest achievement during this period has nothing to do with money. It begins inside the neglected prison library. Under the care of elderly librarian Brooks Hatlin, the library is little more than a forgotten room containing outdated books and limited resources. Most people accept its condition as another unchangeable reality of prison life. Andy refuses to. Instead of complaining, he begins writing letters to the state legislature. Every single week, the requests are polite, professional, and relentlessly consistent. Andy asks for funding, books, educational materials, and opportunities capable of giving inmates something prison rarely offers: intellectual growth. His efforts initially receive predictable responses: small donations, generic rejection letters, occasional sympathy without meaningful action. Most people would stop. Andy keeps writing, week after week, month after month, year after year. His persistence mirrors the philosophy quietly guiding every aspect of his character. Real change rarely arrives through dramatic gestures. More often, it emerges through consistent effort sustained long after others lose patience. Eventually, persistence wins. Boxes of books begin arriving. Financial support increases. Shelves expand. The once forgotten room gradually transforms into one of Shawshank's most valuable spaces. Prisoners discover opportunities to read, study, and educate themselves. The library becomes far more than a collection of books. It becomes proof that hope can take physical form. Brooks watches this transformation with quiet gratitude. For years he maintained the library as best he could, preserving knowledge inside an environment seemingly designed to discourage curiosity. Andy doesn't replace Brooks' legacy. He builds upon it, honoring the older man's dedication while creating something future generations of inmates can inherit. Then comes one of the film's most unforgettable moments. Finding a recording of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, Andy locks himself inside the warden's office and broadcasts the music through Shawshank's public address system. Suddenly the prison freezes. Conversations stop. Work ceases. Prisoners slowly look toward the sky as voices unlike anything they have heard inside those walls drift across the yard. Few understand the language. Fewer still know the opera itself. Yet none of that matters. Beauty requires no translation. For several breathtaking minutes, music accomplishes what no physical escape ever could. It carries every man beyond Shawshank's walls without requiring anyone to move. Even the guards seem momentarily uncertain how to react, as if something invisible has interrupted the prison's ordinary rhythm. Red later admits he has no idea what the women in the opera were singing. He doesn't need to know. Whatever those voices expressed felt larger than words. They reminded everyone listening that somewhere beyond concrete, barbed wire and routine, another world still existed. A world untouched by prison. The punishment for Andy's defiance is swift. Solitary confinement awaits him. But even isolation cannot erase what happened. By this stage of the story, Andy has undergone a profound transformation. He is no longer simply surviving Shawshank's cruelty. Through intelligence, patience, education, and acts of quiet rebellion, he has begun transforming the lives of those around him. Without raising his voice or seeking recognition, he proves that institutions may imprison bodies, but they cannot completely imprison imagination, knowledge, or hope unless people willingly surrender them first. If the first half of the Shawshank Redemption gradually convinces us that hope can survive even inside prison, the midpoint exists to challenge that belief with devastating force. Frank Darabont deliberately places Andy's greatest emotional victories beside his most painful setbacks, reminding both the characters and the audience that progress is never guaranteed. Just when Shawshank begins to feel slightly more humane, the institution reveals its true power once again. The warning arrives through Brooks Hatlin. For decades, Brooks has been one of the prison's gentlest souls. He cares for the library with quiet devotion, feeds his pet crow Jake, and moves through Shawshank with the routine of a man who has forgotten there is another world beyond its walls. When parole finally arrives after more than 50 years of imprisonment, logic suggests it should be the happiest day of his life. Instead, Brooks is terrified. His panic initially confuses the younger inmates. Freedom is supposed to be the dream everyone chases. Yet Brooks reacts as though he has been handed a death sentence. In a desperate attempt to remain inside the only life he understands, he even threatens another inmate with a knife. It is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of fear. The prison has accomplished something horrifying. It has transformed captivity into safety. Once released, Brooks struggles with a world that continued moving while he remained frozen in time. Cars travel faster than he remembers. Streets feel louder. Everyday decisions become overwhelming. Even crossing a road feels terrifying because the pace of modern life no longer matches the rhythm his mind has learned over half a century behind bars. His letters to the men at Shawshank become increasingly heartbreaking. He describes his loneliness, his inability to sleep, and the constant feeling that nothing around him truly belongs to him anymore. Outside prison, Brooks possesses legal freedom but has lost psychological freedom. The institution no longer surrounds him physically because it now exists inside him. Then comes one of the film's most haunting images. Brooks was here. The words carved into the wooden beam before his suicide transform a simple phrase into a permanent reminder of institutionalization's ultimate cost. Brooks leaves behind no dramatic farewell, only the quiet evidence that a man once existed, struggled, and ultimately found the outside world more unbearable than the prison he had spent decades longing to escape. For Andy and Red, Brooks' fate becomes more than a personal tragedy. It becomes a warning. Hope is not enough by itself. A person must also remember how to live once hope becomes reality. As the emotional impact of Brooks' death settles over Shawshank, another inmate arrives whose presence quietly alters the course of the story. Tommy Williams enters the prison with youthful energy completely unlike the older prisoners around him. Talkative, impulsive, and often humorous, Tommy injects fresh life into an environment dominated by routine. Unlike Brooks or Red, he has not yet been shaped by decades of institutionalization. His future still feels unwritten. Andy quickly notices his intelligence beneath the rough exterior. Encouraging Tommy to continue his education, Andy begins helping him prepare for his high school equivalency exams. Once again, Andy invests in someone else's future before thinking about his own. Education remains his preferred form of resistance because knowledge represents possibility, and possibility is the one thing Shawshank cannot completely eliminate. Then, during an ordinary conversation, everything changes. While discussing their criminal cases, Tommy casually mentions serving time with another inmate years earlier. That prisoner had bragged about murdering a wealthy woman, and her lover before allowing the woman's banker husband to take the blame. The name Tommy remembers is Elmo Blatch. The room falls silent. For the audience, this is the confirmation long suspected but never explicitly stated. Andy truly is innocent. More importantly, there is finally a living witness capable of connecting the real killer to the crime that destroyed Andy's life. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, legal freedom appears possible. Andy immediately brings the information to Warden Norton, believing justice will finally prevail. His request is remarkably modest. He simply wants the opportunity to reopen his case using Tommy's testimony. But Norton no longer sees Andy as an innocent man deserving justice. He sees him as an investment. Over the years, Andy has become essential to the warden's expanding financial empire. Through carefully organized accounting and the fictional identity of Randall Stevens, Andy launders enormous sums of illegal money while protecting Norton's public reputation. Releasing Andy would not simply free an innocent prisoner. It would expose years of corruption, fraud, and abuse. At that moment, Norton's priorities become unmistakably clear. Justice means nothing. Power means everything. Pretending to consider Andy's request, Norton secretly arranges a meeting with Tommy under the cover of night. Guards escort the young inmate into the prison yard, creating the illusion that his testimony will finally be heard. Instead, Hadley raises his rifle. One gunshot echoes through the darkness. Tommy dies instantly. The official explanation claims he was attempting to escape, but everyone understands the truth. Tommy wasn't murdered because he posed a security threat. He was executed because he possessed information capable of exposing the institution's corruption. It is one of the coldest moments in the entire film. Norton doesn't merely silence a witness. He destroys the last legal path to Andy's freedom. When Andy confronts him, expecting at least some trace of remorse, Norton responds with complete indifference. The Bible-quoting warden who constantly speaks of morality has now ordered the death of an innocent man to protect stolen money and preserve his authority. His hypocrisy reaches its horrifying conclusion. As punishment for refusing to accept this injustice, Andy is sentenced to solitary confinement. Not for a few days, for 2 full months. The whole becomes the darkest space in a film already filled with confinement. Isolated from every friendship he has built, stripped of conversation, routine, and human contact, Andy is forced to confront the possibility that Shawshank has finally defeated him. The legal system has failed. The prison administration has betrayed him. The truth has been buried alongside Tommy. For the first time, escape through official channels becomes impossible. The system will never willingly correct its mistake because the system itself now depends upon maintaining the lie. It is Andy's lowest emotional point, but beneath that despair something else quietly begins taking shape. When every lawful path has been permanently sealed, only one possibility remains. The prison believes it has eliminated hope forever. In reality, it has unknowingly pushed Andy toward the only plan Shawshank never imagined he could achieve. The greatest plot twists don't simply surprise an audience. They force every earlier scene to be reinterpreted through an entirely new perspective. The Shawshank Redemption achieves exactly that, transforming seemingly ordinary moments into pieces of an extraordinary long-term strategy. The tiny rock hammer, the hobby of collecting stones, the requests for movie posters, even Red's casual joke that the hammer would take centuries to dig through prison walls. All of it suddenly fits together with breathtaking precision. Andy never stopped planning. He simply planned on a timescale almost no one else could imagine. For nearly 2 decades, hidden behind posters that evolved with the passing years, from Rita Hayworth to Marilyn Monroe and eventually Raquel Welch, Andy quietly chipped away at the concrete wall of his cell. The tunnel remained invisible because everyone inside Shawshank had learned to stop looking beyond the obvious. Guards searched for weapons, contraband, and signs of rebellion. They never imagined that patience itself could become the most powerful escape tool of all. The posters symbolize far more than concealment. Each actress represents a different era passing beyond the prison walls, while Andy remains physically confined. Seasons change. Popular culture evolves. The outside world continues moving forward. Yet behind those familiar faces, Andy is doing the same thing every single day. A few careful strikes. A handful of dust scattered unnoticed into the prison yard. Tiny actions so insignificant individually that nobody questions them. The genius of the escape lies in its invisibility. Not because the tunnel is physically hidden, but because human beings naturally underestimate consistent effort accumulated over time. Shawshank expected dramatic escape attempts fueled by desperation. Andy chose discipline instead. Then comes the storm. Thunder echoes across the prison as Andy removes the poster one final time and crawls into the tunnel he has spent years creating. Ahead lies nearly 500 yards of foul-smelling sewage pipes separating him from freedom. The physical challenge is horrifying, but the symbolism runs even deeper. Before Andy can reach a new life, he must literally crawl through decades of accumulated filth. Freedom demands endurance not only of stone walls, but of everything those walls represent. The sequence unfolds almost entirely without dialogue. Every scrape against the narrow tunnel reminds us of the years invested in this impossible journey. Every movement carries the weight of patience rewarded. Finally, Andy reaches the massive sewer pipe blocking his path. Using the same rock hammer that once seemed almost laughably small, he breaks through. The torrent carries him into darkness. Moments later, beneath pouring rain, Andy emerges from the pipe and collapses into the mud. Then he stands, arms stretched toward the sky, rain washing away prison dirt, fear, and 20 years of confinement. It is one of cinema's most unforgettable images because it expresses something words never could. The rain doesn't merely clean Andy's body. It becomes a visual baptism, marking the death of one life and the beginning of another. For the first time in decades, there are no walls above him, no bars surrounding him, and no institution defining who he is. Meanwhile, Shawshank awakens to complete confusion. The morning headcount begins as always until a guard notices Andy's apparent refusal to respond. Angered, Hadley throws a rock toward the familiar poster hanging on the wall. Instead of striking paper, it crashes straight through. Behind Raquel Welch's smiling face waits only darkness. The tunnel's discovery remains one of the most satisfying reveals in film history, because the audience experiences the same astonishment as the characters. Every quiet moment we previously accepted suddenly reveals hidden purpose. What looked like routine was preparation. What appeared to be harmless hobbies were essential pieces of a master plan. But Andy's escape is only half the victory. Before leaving Shawshank, he carefully collected decades of financial records exposing Warden Norton's illegal money laundering operation. Assuming the identity of Randall Stevens, the fictional man whose paperwork Andy had meticulously maintained for years, he withdraws the stolen funds and anonymously delivers evidence of the corruption to newspapers and law enforcement. The prison that depended upon secrecy suddenly faces complete public exposure. Investigators descend upon Shawshank. Captain Hadley is arrested. Corrupt bookkeeping, illegal labor practices, bribery, and murder can no longer remain hidden behind respectable appearances. The walls that once protected those in power become evidence against them. Warden Norton retreats to his office, the same office where he quoted scripture, displayed his Bible, and preached morality while exploiting innocent men. As police close in, he realizes there is no escape left. Moments later, a single gunshot ends his story. His suicide completes one of the film's most powerful reversals. The man who spent years controlling everyone else's fate ultimately cannot face the consequences of his own choices. Authority built upon hypocrisy inevitably collapses under the weight of truth. Yet the emotional climax still belongs to Red. Years pass before his own parole hearing finally arrives. Throughout the film, Red has repeated rehearsed speeches expressing rehabilitation, because he believes honesty serves no purpose. This time everything changes. Instead of telling officials what they expect to hear, he openly admits his regret, his mistakes, and the impossibility of judging the frightened young man he once was. For the first time, Red speaks not to gain freedom, but because he has learned the value of truth. The board grants parole. Stepping into the outside world, Red immediately experiences the same fear that consumed Brooks. The routines feel unfamiliar. The loneliness returns. Following Brooks' path, he rents the same room and even carves new words beside the old message. Brooks was here. Then beneath it. So was Red. The parallel is heartbreaking because history seems ready to repeat itself. But Andy anticipated this moment years earlier. Following carefully hidden instructions, Red discovers money buried beneath a volcanic rock and a letter inviting him to travel south. The words remind him of something he once dismissed as foolish: hope. For perhaps the first time in his life, Red chooses faith over fear. Crossing the border into Mexico, he finally reaches the small Pacific town Andy described with almost mythical affection, Zihuatanejo. There, beside an endless blue ocean, Andy quietly restores an old fishing boat beneath an open sky. No speeches are necessary. The two friends simply embrace. After decades spent surrounded by stone walls, locked doors, and impossible odds, they stand together on a beach where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. It is a conclusion that feels deeply earned because the film never promises that hope makes life easy. Instead, it proves something far more profound. Hope asks us to keep moving even when freedom seems impossible, trusting that patience, integrity, and unwavering belief can one day carry us beyond the walls we believed would define us forever. At first glance, Andy Dufresne seems like an unusual choice for a cinematic hero. He isn't physically imposing. He rarely raises his voice. He doesn't inspire others through charismatic speeches or dramatic acts of rebellion. In many films, a protagonist earns admiration by dominating every room they enter. Andy does almost the opposite. He speaks softly, observes carefully, and often appears emotionally unreadable. Yet this apparent passivity hides one of the strongest psychological portraits ever created in modern cinema. The jury mistakes Andy's silence for emotional emptiness. Throughout the courtroom scenes, his calm answers sound detached rather than devastated. He refuses to perform grief in the way people expect an innocent man to behave. Because audiences often associate visible emotion with honesty, Andy's restraint becomes another piece of evidence against him. His inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to display his inner turmoil convinces others that he must be hiding something. Ironically, the very quality that condemns him outside prison becomes the reason he survives inside it. Shawshank is designed to exploit emotional reactions. Anger invites punishment. Fear attracts predators. Despair leads to surrender. Andy instinctively understands that allowing the prison to dictate his emotional state would mean granting it complete control over his identity. Instead of responding impulsively, he develops an extraordinary level of emotional regulation. His silence isn't emptiness. It's discipline. That distinction changes everything. Psychologically, Andy operates with two different goals that exist simultaneously throughout the story. On the surface, his immediate objective is survival. He must endure violent inmates, corrupt authority figures, exhausting labor, and decades of uncertainty. These are practical challenges requiring intelligence and adaptability. Beneath that visible struggle lies a much deeper objective. Andy refuses to let Shawshank imprison his mind. This becomes his true mission from the moment he enters the institution. While the prison systematically strips away names, routines, ambitions, and individuality, Andy quietly protects the parts of himself no guard can confiscate. He continues reading. He studies geology. He carves chess pieces. He builds a library. He listens to opera. Every one of these seemingly ordinary activities serves the same psychological purpose. They remind him that he remains more than inmate number 37927. The prison wants obedient bodies. Andy protects a free spirit. That internal freedom explains many of his most surprising decisions. Why risk his life to secure beer for other prisoners instead of requesting personal privileges? Why dedicate years to expanding a library he may never fully enjoy? Why educate Tommy when doing so offers no obvious benefit? These choices seem irrational if survival is Andy's only motivation. But survival isn't enough. He wants to preserve his humanity. One of the film's most subtle psychological layers involves Andy's relationship with guilt. Legally, he is innocent of murdering his wife and her lover. Morally, however, Andy never completely absolves himself. He openly admits that his marriage had become emotionally distant. He focused on work. He withdrew instead of confronting difficult conversations. By the night of the murders, anger had replaced communication, and although he ultimately chose not to kill anyone, he recognizes that the relationship had already collapsed long before tragedy struck. This distinction makes Andy far more complex than a conventional innocent hero. He isn't burdened by guilt over the crime itself. He's burdened by regret. The regret of emotional neglect. The regret of opportunities lost forever. the regret that some wounds cannot be repaired, even when justice eventually arrives. That emotional burden explains why Andy never becomes obsessed with proving his innocence at every possible moment. He knows legal innocence doesn't erase personal failure. His imprisonment is unjust, but his conscience remains complicated. Rather than defining himself through victimhood, he accepts responsibility for the mistakes that genuinely belong to him, while refusing responsibility for those that do not. Few protagonists display that level of psychological maturity. Perhaps Andy's defining characteristic is his relationship with time. Most people think in days or weeks. Prisoners often think in parole hearings or remaining sentences. Andy thinks in decades. His escape plan perfectly illustrates this mindset. Digging through solid concrete with a tiny rock hammer appears impossible, because most people imagine attempting the entire task at once. Andy never approaches it that way. He focuses on one small action repeated consistently over an unimaginably long period. A few careful strikes. Every day. For nearly 20 years. This philosophy extends far beyond the tunnel itself. Building the library follows the same pattern through weekly letters. Earning the trust of fellow prisoners develops through countless quiet conversations. Even his friendship with Red grows gradually instead of dramatically. Andy understands a truth modern audiences often struggle to accept. Extraordinary outcomes are usually created through ordinary habits, sustained with extraordinary consistency. His greatest weapon isn't intelligence alone. It's patience. In today's world where success is often measured by immediate results, Andy represents a radically different model of resilience. He never confuses slow progress with failure. As long as movement continues, no matter how small, hope remains alive. This perspective also explains why many viewers interpret Andy as a mythic or even Christ-like figure. The comparison isn't based on perfection but on transformation. Throughout the film, Andy repeatedly sacrifices personal comfort to improve the lives of others. He brings education into Shawshank. He restores dignity through simple acts of kindness. He gives prisoners moments of beauty through music. He inspires hope in men who had forgotten such emotions existed. Most importantly, he changes Red. Before meeting Andy, Red believes institutionalization is inevitable. Hope appears dangerous because disappointment feels unavoidable. Andy never argues against Red directly. Instead, he quietly lives according to different principles until Red gradually begins questioning his own assumptions. That is the mark of a true catalyst. He transforms people not through force but through example. By the film's conclusion, Andy has escaped physically, but his greatest achievement occurred long before crawling through the tunnel. He proved that freedom begins as a psychological choice rather than a geographical location. Long before he reached Zihuatanejo, Andy had already escaped Shawshank in the only place that truly mattered. His body remained imprisoned for 20 years, but his spirit never accepted the sentence. That unwavering commitment to preserving his inner self is what elevates Andy Dufresne from an unforgettable character into one of cinema's most enduring symbols of resilience, hope, and quiet human strength. Every memorable hero is defined not only by personal strength but by the force opposing that strength. In The Shawshank Redemption, the antagonists are far more than cruel authority figures standing between Andy Dufresne and freedom. Warden Samuel Norton and Captain Byron Hadley represent two different philosophies of power. One controls through ideology, the other controls through fear. Together, they transform Shawshank from a prison into a machine designed to erase individuality, while convincing everyone inside that such oppression is both necessary and justified. Captain Byron Hadley is the easier villain to recognize. From his first appearance, physical intimidation defines every aspect of his character. His authority comes from size, unpredictability, and the willingness to inflict pain without hesitation. Hadley rarely argues because he doesn't need to. Violence is his preferred language, and everyone around him understands it fluently. The brutal beating of the terrified new inmate on the first night isn't simply punishment for making noise. It's a calculated public demonstration reminding every prisoner that resistance carries unbearable consequences. Fear becomes institutional policy. Hadley exists as the prison's visible fist, ensuring obedience through constant uncertainty. Nobody knows exactly when his temper will explode, and that unpredictability becomes as powerful as the violence itself. Psychologically, This creates an environment where prisoners begin policing their own behavior before punishment is even necessary. The mere possibility of Hadley's intervention is often enough to silence disagreement. Yet beneath that terrifying exterior lies a revealing insecurity. Whenever financial matters arise, Hadley becomes completely dependent on Andy. Taxes, inheritance laws, investments, and legal paperwork belong to a world beyond his understanding. His physical dominance cannot solve intellectual problems. This dependence subtly exposes the limits of brute force. Violence may command obedience, but it cannot create knowledge, wisdom, or long-term vision. That role belongs to Andy. Standing beside Hadley is Warden Samuel Norton, a far more complicated and unsettling antagonist because his greatest weapon isn't brutality. It's morality, or at least the appearance of it. Norton introduces himself as a deeply religious man committed to discipline, order, and redemption. Scripture decorates his office. Bible verses accompany his speeches. He presents Shawshank as a place where broken men can discover responsibility through honest labor and spiritual guidance. To newcomers, he resembles a strict father determined to save wayward souls rather than destroy them. The tragedy is that Norton genuinely believes this image. Unlike villains who openly embrace corruption, Norton constructs an internal narrative where every unethical decision somehow serves a righteous purpose. In his own mind, he isn't exploiting prisoners. He's teaching them discipline. He isn't stealing money. He's rewarding efficient leadership. He isn't protecting corruption. He's preserving institutional stability. Self-delusion becomes the foundation of his identity. This psychological complexity makes Norton particularly dangerous because people capable of justifying their own cruelty rarely recognize the need to change. Every immoral act is carefully reframed as responsibility. Every abuse of power becomes another sacrifice made for the greater good. The Bible itself becomes one of his most effective tools. Throughout the film, Norton repeatedly encourages Andy to read Scripture, quoting passages about salvation, obedience, and divine guidance. On the surface, these moments appear sincere, reinforcing his carefully maintained image as a man devoted to faith. But Darabont quietly transforms the Bible into a symbol of profound hypocrisy. One verse displayed prominently declares, "I am the light of the world." The words promise truth, honesty, and moral clarity. Yet behind the wall decoration bearing that message hides Norton's secret safe, filled with records documenting years of fraud, bribery, illegal profits, and financial corruption. The visual irony is devastating. The very object representing spiritual illumination literally conceals darkness. Religion, for Norton, has become camouflage. Instead of allowing faith to shape his actions, he reshapes faith until it justifies whatever actions he already wishes to take. Scripture becomes another instrument of control, no different from locked cells or armed guards. Its purpose isn't inspiration. It's authority. This creates one of the film's most fascinating contrasts. Andy almost never speaks about religion directly, yet consistently embodies values commonly associated with spiritual teachings: compassion, forgiveness, patience, sacrifice, hope. Norton constantly speaks about religion, while violating nearly every principle he claims to uphold. The audience gradually realizes that true morality emerges through behavior rather than language. Another revealing difference between Andy and Norton lies in their relationship with control. Norton desperately believes every variable can be managed. Prisoners must follow schedules. Guards must enforce discipline. Financial records must remain hidden. Witnesses must disappear. Every threat to his authority demands immediate elimination because uncertainty terrifies him. Andy takes the opposite approach. He cannot control the court's verdict. He cannot control prison walls. He cannot control Hadley's violence or Norton's corruption. Instead of wasting energy fighting the uncontrollable, he focuses entirely on the choices still available to him. He controls his patience, his habits, his curiosity, his friendships, his hope. Psychologically, Andy possesses flexibility while Norton demands rigidity. That difference ultimately determines their fates. As the story progresses, Norton becomes increasingly imprisoned by his own lies. Every crime requires another cover-up. Every deception creates additional vulnerability. Maintaining power consumes more energy each year until the institution he believed he controlled begins controlling him instead. Ironically, the free man becomes the prisoner. His office transforms into a cell built from greed, paranoia, and pride. He cannot expose Andy because Andy knows too much. He cannot release Andy because the financial empire would collapse. He cannot confess because his public identity depends entirely upon appearing righteous. Every decision narrows his remaining options. Andy, meanwhile, appears physically confined but grows psychologically stronger. The prison cannot predict him because his freedom exists where bars have no reach. While Norton accumulates wealth, Andy accumulates resilience. While Norton expands corruption, Andy expands the library. While Norton protects power through fear, Andy inspires others through hope. By the final act, the thematic reversal is complete. The warden standing outside prison walls is spiritually trapped by his own ambition. The inmate locked inside a concrete cell possesses an inner freedom no amount of authority can destroy. That reversal reveals the film's deeper understanding of power itself. Real imprisonment isn't measured by walls or sentences. It is measured by whatever controls your choices. Norton allows greed and pride to become his prison. Hadley surrenders himself to violence because force is the only language he understands. Andy chooses something entirely different. By refusing to let fear, hatred, or despair define his identity, he quietly escapes long before anyone discovers the tunnel hidden behind his cell wall. Although The Shawshank Redemption is often remembered as Andy Dufresne's story, its emotional heartbeat belongs to the people surrounding him. Frank Darabont understands that hope only becomes meaningful when it changes others, so every major supporting character represents a different response to imprisonment. Together, they transform Shawshank from a collection of inmates into a living psychological landscape where every friendship, every loss, and every conversation reflects another possibility for the human spirit. At the center of that landscape stands Ellis Boyd Red Redding. Red isn't simply the narrator. He is the audience's guide, interpreter, and emotional anchor. We experience Andy through Red's eyes because Red initially sees the world the way most people would. Practical, skeptical, conditioned by experience rather than idealism. After decades behind bars, he has learned that unrealistic expectations usually lead to disappointment. Hope in his mind isn't inspiring. It's dangerous. That belief isn't born from pessimism alone. It is a carefully developed coping mechanism. Every prisoner who spends enough time dreaming about freedom risks being crushed when reality refuses to cooperate. By lowering expectations, Red protects himself from emotional devastation. If he never expects happiness, he can never truly lose it. Institutionalization has taught him emotional survival. Unlike Andy, Red no longer measures life by possibility. He measures it by routine. This makes him the perfect audience surrogate because his transformation mirrors our own. At first, Andy's optimism appears unrealistic. His patience feels impossible. His belief in beauty inside prison borders on foolishness. But as Red slowly begins questioning his own assumptions, the audience does exactly the same. The brilliance of Morgan Freeman's performance lies in its restraint. Red rarely experiences dramatic emotional breakdowns. Instead, change arrives gradually through small shifts in expression, quieter moments of reflection, and increasingly thoughtful narration. By the film's conclusion, Red has not simply regained his freedom. He has rediscovered the ability to imagine a future beyond fear. If Red